Now you might already know that Manchester almost got an underground railway line known as the Picc-Vic line, joining up the two biggest stations in the city, Piccadilly and Victoria, and creating that well-needed connection between north and south. And it was well thought out, it was well planned, they'd already done a lot of testing for it, it was well liked by the public, and it had gone through pretty much all the stages of bureaucracy in order to get approval. It pretty much got government approval. But it never happened. And for a city like Manchester, which went railway mad before anyone else in the world, the fact that it's never had an underground has always felt a little bit weird. But did you also know that the Picc-Vic line wasn't the first or indeed the last attempt to get an underground here in Manchester? In fact, Manchester's been obsessed with the idea for like forever, and it's something it keeps coming back to again and again and again and again and again. So what we're going to do in this video is look at some of these ideas, see whether they're any good, try and figure out why this is Manchester's strangest engineering obsession, and whether the whole enterprise is just a bit pointless. The first underground anywhere in the world was in London and opened in 1863, and soon after, loads of other cities around the world were after some of that sweet, sweet subterranean swiftness. There are about 250 cities today that have or will very soon open underground rapid transit systems, including in Britain, Glasgow and Tyne and Weir. But Manchester, no, but it did really, really want one, and ever since London got its first, it's an idea that Manchester's kept coming back to again and again and again. You know, like some tragic old man who keeps revisiting a childhood dream he once had, hoping that someone will come along and make it come true. It's an obsession. And it very nearly got one, a proper one, all the way back in 1902, and it nearly made its way all the way to Parliament, except it was withdrawn for some reason at the very last minute. Let's jump back to 1902. Manchester is a bustling industrial city, but as we've seen in the last few videos, its city centre is badly designed and the number of people living here has fallen. This is before cars, of course, so most people are walking. This is also the age of the horse and cart, but that doesn't mean that the streets aren't clogged with traffic. The need for some form of mass transit is more and more apparent. By 1901, horse-drawn trams were replaced by electric trams, and the lines covered the city centre, but this was still painfully slow compared to what an underground tube system could do, so it seemed only a matter of time before Manchester got one. In 1902, the City Circle Railway was proposed, with plans drawn up by engineers named Justin and Jackson. A bill was submitted to Parliament for approval for the company and permission for work to begin. So what was the idea they came up with? The actual plans for the railway haven't been digitised online, but they are held at Chetham's library. In fact, there's very little about this proposal online at all, apart from a mapping project headed up by Dr. Martin Dodge at Manchester University. And by the way, if there's a historical map of Manchester digitised somewhere online, Dr. Dodge is probably the guy to thank for it. Firstly, this was going to be an all-electric underground line in twin tunnels, at least 25 feet below ground level. Starting at Piccadilly Station, the line would have headed west under Whitworth Street to a station close to Oxford Road, before then turning northwards, crossing beneath the Rochdale Canal, and to Mount Street for a connection to the now closed mainline Central Station. A station at Albert Square was next, followed by one at St Anne's Square, and then at Hunts Bank for another connection to a now gone Exchange Station. It's not far at all from there to the next stop at this end of Victoria Station, and then a swoosh over to Whittle Street in this area where at the time there was a wholesale and retail market and where people flocked to from miles around. The penultimate station served Piccadilly Gardens at the junction with Oldham Street, and then the whole thing returned at last to London Road to serve the mainline connection, completing the loop. And the proposal even came up with 3 classes. It was a product of its time. So it came up with first, second and third class passenger carriages to, I suppose, separate the people who actually did all the work from the riffraff. Now, there's so little information on this project that the exact reason it didn't make it to Parliament is not really known. Money, probably. But did it actually make sense? Manchester has a relatively small city centre. It's just over a mile in diameter and nowhere is longer than a 20 to 30 minute walk or even wheel to get to. And this proposal didn't even bother heading down towards Castlefield, so even at the most distant stops, would it really be worth heading down the stairs or a lift, buying a ticket at the booth, waiting for the next train to arrive, all of which eats up time, only to shave a few minutes off a brisk walk? Not really. The line would have improved passage through the city, but at too great an expense to make economic sense. The failure of the 1902 plan didn't stop other cross-city schemes popping up. In fact, in 1903, one appeared which abandoned the idea of a circular navigation of the city and sought to connect the 5 major stations with the 3 major sites within the city: Market Street, Piccadilly Gardens and St Peter's Square. Now, out of all of them, this was a really good scheme. It was a really good idea. It was probably the most feasible as well. But again, it fell flat on its face. One from 1914 just went for a direct Huntsbank to Piccadilly route, and one from 1938 revived pretty much the old 1902 route, but with some differences. The reason none of these could stick is summed up in this: the 1945 City of Manchester plan we've looked at before. This is the planning document of all planning documents when it comes to Manchester. It's the origin story of most of Manchester's 20th century planning decisions, and also the kryptonite of others. The author, engineer Roland Nicholas, explains that for an underground railway, the probable traffic and revenues of a population the size to be served in Manchester would not be sufficient to enable any of these tube systems to be constructed and run, except at a continuing loss. Now, this all kind of does actually make sense, but you have to remember that Nicholas's idea of a future for Manchester was so idealistic that he pretty much advocated flattening the entire city centre and starting again from scratch, and basing the new one around a high-speed road system. Like many engineers of his generation, Nicholas could see that human race was about to enter the age of the automobile, and he based Manchester's entire transport plan around that. And what did he come up with? This: the City Circle Line, an inner ring road all connected by roundabouts, allowing drivers to drive from one part of the city to the next as quickly as possible. At this point, at Manchester subway system seems more like a box-ticking exercise, but there was real legitimate reasons the idea kept coming back. And it all comes down to Manchester's mainline rail access. As we've seen, by the start of the 20th century, Manchester and Salford had 6 mainline stations, 5 of which were nicely spread out, and one of which was nice and central. It was straightforward to cross the city by rail in north-west and west-south directions, but there was an obvious gap here, making north to south and south to north journeys complicated. So passengers arriving at Piccadilly, for example, and hoping to head further north would often have to make their own way to Victoria to make the connection. And of course, vice versa. The question therefore was how to plug the gap and directly connect the city's 2 biggest stations. By the late 1960s, an updated idea gained real traction: the Picc-Vic line. This would be a 1.5 mile sweeping underground arc that had 5 stops altogether. 1 at each end at the major stations, of course, and 3 in the middle at Whitworth Street and Princess Street, beneath Central Library, and around Market Street and Corporation Street, a station named Royal Exchange. Now, this wouldn't be a completely disconnected line from the mainline system, but an actual underground section of the heavy mainline that allowed trains to drop beneath the city streets at Ardwick Junction and re-emerge at Queen's Road on the Bury line, connecting to Picc and Vic via low-level platforms and underground travellators. The major organisation behind the idea was CELMEC, the transport authority behind the 1962 road plan, and the reason why the Mancunian Way was built at the same time. But this got further than just clever marketing from CELMEC and rough lines on maps. Actual exhaustive testing was done of conditions of Manchester's bedrock, and a widespread public engagement programme was begun. Serious consideration was also given to how the tunnel was going to pass through the city. Not surprisingly, there are other underground structures in the city centre, including around Whitworth Street, where a station would have had to avoid the culverted Shooter's Brook and Duke's Tunnel. Even worse, it would have had to thread the needle over, or maybe even under, what was at the time the mysterious Guardian Underground Telephone Exchange. A long tunnel underground built during the Cold War era to make sure Manchester's communication could continue in the event of heavy bombing. The Guardian Exchange was so secretive that it is not even alluded to in the published Picc-Vic plans, and in the 1960s the exact depth of it below the city streets was known only to a select few. The shutting of Central Station in 1969 boosted calls for the Picc-Vic line to come into fruition, but despite all of those cool retro plans, parliamentary approval and really strong support from the public, the money just couldn't be found, and so the whole idea was just shelved. What took it off the shelf and slammed it into a million pieces on the general floor area around the bin was, well, would you believe it, an old resource Manchester used to have in abundance, but shamefully got rid of: on-street trams. Known to everybody today as the trams, but technically I suppose referred to as light rail, the first Metrolink line provided a cheaper way of carrying people across the city than an underground. Even though it was designed with expansion in mind, the first phase to be built made sure to connect Victoria and Piccadilly via a junction at Piccadilly Gardens. The success of this scheme and the subsequent expansion of it over the years has not only made Manchester Metrolink the largest network of light rail mass transit anywhere in the country, but has also more or less put the nail in the coffin for any underground to ever be built. A weary traveller looking to connect trains at both stations can now expect to do so in about 13 minutes, which is about 12 minutes or so less than someone can briskly walk. Factor in scanning through a ticket booth and waiting on the platform, and it's no slower really than the underground option would have been, and much easier for people with heavy luggage or who have to use wheelchairs and mobility scooters. The good thing about the Picc-Vic line, of course, was that it wasn't really for people making connections, but it really tried to tackle that age-old problem of providing a through link north and south for mainline trains. That through route problem was finally solved over here, in a corner of the city we haven't even talked about yet, where, to be honest, even Victorian engineers let the city down. Now, back in the day of competing private ownership of railways, nobody ever put effort into this. This is the Ordsall Chord, a direct connection between the two major rail lines into the city centre, and therefore the two major stations in Manchester. So even though Manchester was the first city to really go railway mad in the 1830s and 40s, all of its stations were built primarily for goods, so to stock up the warehouses, and not really for passengers. So all these private companies that own these stations and own the lines going into them didn't really care about how passengers would move through the city. Now, when this opened in 2017 or whatever it was, you'd think that all talk of an underground tunnel in Manchester would have fizzled out, but it actually hasn't, and it's still coming back. This is an idea that's been going since the 1860s, various different ideas, various different guises, and even though we've got that direct connection between Victoria and Piccadilly now, north and south, people are still talking about an underground. When you look at the city centre, the idea for an underground in the city centre, the only way that would really be feasible today is if it had a super fast element to it. So if you could get whipped around the city within a couple of minutes from one side to another and you could really save some good time, that would make more sense. Well, this now begs the question to me, how fast do we actually need to be? Isn't all this clock watching and rushing about all a little bit unnecessary? For a city as walkable as Manchester, do we really need an underground? Do we really need to go from like Albert Square to Piccadilly Gardens in 2 minutes rather than a 5 or 10 minute walk? What is it about the modern world that we're so allergic to taking our time and breathing a little? For me, the only way an underground would be feasible in Manchester is if it reached all 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester. The city centre is probably too small for an underground, let's face it. But if it reached all 10 boroughs, that to me would make sense. An underground system built and planned properly across Greater Manchester would not only speed up travel, but would allow direct travel between all the town centres, decentralising everything and boosting the economies of these town centres, taking the focus off Manchester. So there you go, a history of Manchester's underground obsession. Do let me know what you think of that in the comments below, what you think of these two plans we've focused in on, what you think of other plans, and when it comes to the city centre, whether you think Manchester needs an underground at all, or whether we should focus on making walking a more enjoyable experience.
All aboard the toxic gossip train. You're chugging down the tracks of misinformation. The toxic gossip train. You got a one-way ticket to manipulation station. Toxic gossip train. Tie me to the tracks and harass me for my past. 'Cause rumors look like facts. If you don't mind the gaps, I won't survive in the crash, but